We have beautiful clear stamps and coordinating dies as well as a lot of other products.
And I've been exploring them to make cards look prettier. So let's start with the first card where I have taken a white top folding card base. All my card bases are going to be 5.5 inches by 4.25. The craft cardstock is half an inch less and the white cardstock is around 1.5 inches smaller so as to give a broad border for this card. I'm going to do spotlight stamping and spotlight embossing for my first card, and I hope you would like this technique. If you have a stamping platform, the spotlight stamping is going to be very easy. There are various ways of doing this technique, but I don't like to waste paper, which happens in most of the techniques, so I do my stamping this way. I take some tape, not a very strong one, to hold my spotlight card base. So for the rest of the card, I'm going to call the white card base my spotlight card base, and I'll be using a layered pine cone stamp set. You may use baubles or Christmas trees for the same technique. Any stamp would work for this. I stamp my pine cones starting with vintage photo distress oxide. You can use any inks that you may have. Then I add a little lighter ink for my base layer of the cones. I'm using caramel toffee, so the grooves will look darker and the light ink will become the highlights of the cone. So now that we have the cones, let's have some snow on them. So for the next step, you may let the inks dry. Also you can use anti-static powder because we are going to do some heat embossing. But I love the speckled look that we get if the ink is not very dry, and especially when you want snow. I think snow goes everywhere, so I'm not using any anti-static powder. I stamp my third layer with Versamark ink, and for the snow I'm taking opaque bright white embossing powder and I will heat emboss it. So now you get snow in the crevices of the pine cones and some speckles in the cone too. Because I did not use an anti-static powder tool, there are strays of the embossing powder over the cardstock. So with a brush I take the ones which are on places other than the cone, and then I heat emboss my pine cones. Now let's go ahead and make a little tree. I'll be stamping my leaves and stems with teal ink. You can use any dark green that you may have. I arrange my leaves and stem and stamp them in green ink, and you see that on the spotlight cardstock and the craft cardstock, the stamping is not even at the place where they meet. So I mark with a pencil at one of the corners so that I can align my spotlight paper later, and I remove it and then stamp over the stamped image on the craft paper again. So this is my cheater's way and no wastage of paper way to do spotlight stamping. Also, to stamp again, I am going to use an acetate piece so that I can plan where to put my leaves without the fear of getting the ink on my cardstock. You can see how much I have used this acetate piece. I wish I had made a new one for this video. It just has an acetate piece and a washi tape at the end of it so that I can spot it on my messy craft desk. And acetate has this magical power of disappearing. So this washi tape lets it be visible to me all the time. I stamp the leaves on the white cardstock and then I remove it to stamp it again on the craft cardstock. And if you had a big stamp, you may not have to stamp again and again. But because I have these small leaves and I need to fill it up so that it resembles a tree, I need to stamp it often. Also, the stamped impressions, when you're stamping, you will see that it is easier to line the stamps now when you're stamping on the craft cardstock, because you can see where the lines meet on white and craft. So I fill the corner with the needle leaves, and some where I feel there is white space, just to have the tree at one of the corners of the card. For the sentiment, I'm going to use Season's Greetings from the same stamp set that I have used the pine cones from, and we'll use the same brown ink as well, Vintage Photo Distress Oxide, for stamping my sentiment. And now that our stamping is done, let's start the spotlight embossing on our pine cones. I'm using the Speckled Snow embossing folder by Sizzix, and I'm going to place both the cardstocks just the way we stamped it in the folder, and then I run it through my die cutting machine. I have a big shot, and you must check the sandwich your machine recommends. Now with the dry embossed stamped card, I'll separate my spotlight paper. I'm using a palette knife to do so. And I have cut a black matting just a little bigger in size than my spotlight cardstock, which I adhere with double-sided tape. And then this beautiful spotlight image will be mounted on 3D foam tape to give more dimension to my textured card on the craft paper. You can see the groove on the craft paper, and it's very easy to line it up now. And here you have a continuous snowfall embossing, but spotlighted for a different look. The whole panel goes on the white top folding card base, and here you have spotlight stamping and spotlight embossing, both done on this card. With the textured look, this card will look so beautiful sitting on a mantle. I hope you like this technique and would try it with your embossing folders and the stamps you may have in your stash. Let's go ahead and see what we have for you in the next card. Let's do dry embossing a different way with a silicone mat and dies. I'm going to use a Sizzix poinsettia background die for giving texture to my next card. I love clean and simple cards, but I also like to add texture, and dry embossing gives me the perfect look for my card. I'm taking a cardstock which is around 80 pounds, not very heavy as it may crack while embossing. And so to prevent it, I will spritz some water over the cardstock just to moisten it. Then I align it the way I want the dies to emboss and put it over my silicone mat. Now let me show you my way of arrangement for dry embossing with a big shot. I use the platform, I put my silicone mat over it, and then the cardstock and the die, and again a plain paper because our cardstock is wet and it may get some impression from our top layers, which is a shim and one of the plates. And then I run this sandwich through my big shot. And here you get a pretty design of embossing on your paper without an embossing folder. And the next step is making my pretty background more elegant with some vellum. I have these poinsettia flower dies, and I'll make vellum flowers using these dies for a white on white holiday card. Here I have my petals cut, and I'll use some silver mirror cardstock to cut some leaves and twigs. For the sentiment, I am going to use this stamp set and because I want to do some heat embossing with silver embossing powder, I'm going to use the bold letters. I also have a link which will direct you to my website where I have the supply list, the written instructions, and a printable with a freebie, and also ways to utilize the freebie for your Christmas cards. So do not forget to check the link below. Also, I would like to know how many of you have the silicone mat and you've not used it for some time. Personally, I love to use my dies and stamps in different ways, and silicone mat gives me more ways to use the dies and squeeze out more money out of my dies. Now with our embossing done and also the sentiment heat embossed, I use 3D foam tape to layer my embossed panel over a white card base. And here I have I'm using tape runner to adhere the layers of the petals. And I have the center pollen area in silver. I adhere my leaves and twigs with glue just at the middle of the card, overlapping my dry embossing. And I will adhere my poinsettia flower with 3D foam tape for some more dimension. Did you like this monochrome white and white card? Tell me in the comments below what you thought about this card. And now we go to another card with similar techniques but a different look. For the next card, I have a watercolored cardstock and I have protected my surface with a mat, and we will start with some ink smooshing. I'm using watercolors in different shades of blue. You could use distress inks or distress ink reinkers, or even some water-based markers or even watercolors. I spritz it with water and smoosh my cardstock over the inks to get some organic backgrounds. These backgrounds could be used as backgrounds for cards, for die cutting, for stamping, or for dry embossing like I'll use for this card. This is one technique that I think is so easy and effortless, and my aim is to finish off the color on my surface, and I'm using different watercolor papers to smoosh the ink for future use. Do you also make such fun backgrounds for later use? Let me know in the chat box. After the panels were dried, I chose one for my card and I decided to add more texture, and I take pigment powder. I'm using Prussian blue, which is a darker color than my panel. I sprinkle it over my cardstock and spritz some water over it. A shimmery spray would be perfect at this time, but I did not have any. And also I experiment with some more powder over the wet surface till I was happy. I let the panel dry, and once it's dried, I use anti-static powder to stamp my sentiment with Versamark and heat emboss it with silver embossing powder. On the second thought, a die cut sentiment with silver embossing would have looked better for this card. So for your card, you may do that because it was a watercolored cardstock and it had a lot of texture. So the heat embossing and my sentiment does not stand out. Next, I take a white cardstock and cut my watercolored blue panel in a way that it gave a broad, equidistant white border. I use some tape to temporarily adhere my panel over the white cardstock, and it's time to do some spotlight embossing again. I'm using lead snowflake 3D embossing folder, and I arrange my panel in a way that I get snowflakes at two corners of the card, and I run it through my die cutting machine. Let's add bling to this card, and I have taken snowflake dies, 3 sizes of snowflakes. I die cut them with white paper, and now I heat emboss them with silver embossing powder. For it, I just put my snowflake in the Versamark pad so that the sticky ink sticks to the die cut. Then I pour some embossing powder, and to heat set it, I take a scrap paper, put some double-sided tape, and adhere my snowflake with a pointed tool so that it sticks to it, and heat emboss it. For such intricate dies, I think this way is a great way to not burn your fingers, and also if you use tweezers, I feel there is a little gap while heat embossing. I do a second coating of silver embossing powder to give more volume to my embossing and make the snowflake look more textured. Similarly, I do 2 more dies, and now that I have 3 snowflakes, let's assemble the card. I have 2 panels of my embossed cardstock. I use 3D foam tape to adhere the watercolored panel on the white embossed card panel. And here is our spotlight embossing. Adding our snowflakes, I will adhere my snowflakes with glue. I use a top folding navy card base, adhere my textured snowflakes panel over it, and here is our last card. Did you enjoy these techniques? I hope you did. Please tell me in the chat box below if you enjoyed these ideas. If you're on Instagram, please check out my work at Quillish, which is also my website, linked down in the description. And I hope to see you again. Take care. Happy crafting. Bye bye.